Si vous en êtes d'accord, nous allons commencer. Si d'ailleurs vous n'êtes pas d'accord, la démocratie fait que c'est la même chose. Et donc, la seule conséquence étant que vous pouvez aller boire un café. Bien, en tout cas, puisque le président de notre association internationale est arrivé, nous pouvons véritablement commencer notre séance. Je vous remercie d'être aussi nombreux et ce matin, cela va nous permettre de poursuivre nos réflexions sur les questions d'équilibre budgétaire. Mais avant d'en venir au programme de la matinée, vous me permettrez à mon tour de remercier notre collègue et amie, Madame la doyenne Tănăsescu, de la parfaite organisation de cette table ronde et de l'accueil aussi amical, convivial et studieux qu'elle nous réserve. Nous aurons l'occasion de redire quelques mots à ce sujet, je suppose, en fin de matinée, mais je voudrais immédiatement lui dire que cette table ronde s'inscrit dans la grande tradition des tables rondes de l'Association internationale de droit constitutionnel. Christian Stark et moi commençons à être des vieux habitués de ces tables rondes, et donc nous pouvons constater, avec évidemment également Lech Garlicki et quelques autres, que ceci est véritablement un élément de notre continuité. Continuité, mais nouveauté, puisque c'était la première fois que nous avons une réunion en Roumanie, ce qui, pour beaucoup d'entre nous, est extrêmement satisfaisant et même émouvant. Et pour un Français, vous me permettrez de dire qu'il est quand même très remarquable que nous siégions dans une salle, non seulement magnifique, mais qu'il y a dans les bibliothèques autour de cette salle une superbe collection de revues juridiques françaises, avec même le volume de la première année de ce qui est notre grand périodique juridique, le recueil d'Alloz, et il y a ici le volume de 1845, qui est la première année de publication de cette revue. Donc nous voyons là aussi un signe de la traditionnelle coopération entre la Roumanie et la France. Mais nous ne sommes pas là pour parler uniquement de ces liens très, très anciens et très forts que nous avons entre nos deux pays. Nous sommes là pour parler de comparaison internationale et d'essayer de voir comment les règles relatives à l'équilibre budgétaire s'inscrivent dans une démarche dont nous avons compris hier qu'elle était à la fois originale, complexe et multiforme. Alors hier matin, nous avons fait du droit pur. Hier après-midi, nous avons évoqué des problèmes plus théoriques, quelquefois, d'équilibre des pouvoirs, avec la question de savoir si l'équilibre budgétaire remet en cause l'équilibre des pouvoirs, et notamment la répartition des rôles entre les différentes autorités constitutionnelles. Et ce matin, nous avons un titre un tout petit peu énigmatique, équilibre budgétaire et rapport de système, qui nous fait sortir de la sphère juridique, puisque nous allons parler à la fois d'équilibre économique, de normes internationales, de solidarité politique, bref, de sujets qui sont à la marge du droit constitutionnel, notre cœur de métier, et les périphéries. Et c'est quelque chose de tout à fait logique. Progressivement, notre réflexion est partie de ce qui est strictement normatif et s'élargit vers presque l'universel, en tout cas l'intemporel, avec les réflexions de la fin de la matinée. Alors, pour cette matinée, nous avons un programme chargé, ce qui fait que je vais demander à chaque orateur de se limiter à 25 minutes, parce que sinon nous n'y arriverons pas. Et nous avons d'abord M. SCHALTEGGER qui va nous parler de l'influence de la pensée économique sur les normes juridiques relatives à l'équilibre budgétaire, puis M. Catrou Gallos va nous parler de l'influence des organisations internationales, Madame Rodriguez Canotilo de l'influence de l'équipe budgétaire sur les droits fondamentaux. Et ensuite, nous aurons une téléconférence à 11h15 précise, à quelques minutes près, avec Axel Gossery qui est en Belgique, et nous finirons la matinée, s'il arrive, avec M. Iliescu, dont la place est pour l'instant vacante. Voilà. Et nous aurons un débat, et je me tourne vers l'organisatrice en chef, je crois qu'il faut que nous ayons fini vers 12h30, de façon à ce que la suite du programme soit respectée, mais il est toujours plus facile de réduire le temps consacré au déjeuner qu'autre chose. Bien, voilà, nous y sommes. Bon, alors, donc il est, c'est ce que j'ai prévu, 10h45, et je vais donner la parole à M. Schaltegger en lui demandant de terminer pour 11h10.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind invitation to beautiful Bucharest. Mr. Chairman, I have prepared some slides. Shall I go to the computer? So I hope you can still understand me. So, the organizers have given me the title, The Influence of Economic Theories on the Legal Rule of Balanced Budget. And I'm afraid I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I'm an economist, but given the title of my presentation, probably this is not a bad thing. To be
even a good one.
So what can you expect from my side for the following 30 or 25 minutes I have heard from Mr. Chairman? First, I would like to give you some background information on the development of OECD public finances to some sort of motivate the theme. Then I will go through what has been told is my duty. I would like to explain why we economists think that there is a deficit bias, there is an incentive for a debt overhang in politics. You see here some of the arguments that I try to explain you. Some might be familiar with those theories, others probably will hear something new. Then one solution that is explained or is discussed in economic literature is that of fiscal rules. Of course, there are other rules, there are other requirements that you could put in place for balancing the budget, for bringing the asymmetry between spending and revenue responsibilities together. And this is the balanced budget requirement. I will show you some of the experience we have made in Switzerland. We introduced the balanced budget rule in 2003, so we have experience of some 10 years about the working and the pros and cons of such a rule. And finally, I'd like to draw some conclusions. So that's where I start. Probably you can't see all the single countries of the slide here, but it's not important to see the single countries, it's important to see the broad picture. And I think two things here are striking. Probably don't worry, I move. I think two things here are striking.
No.
I will volunteer to do the slides and you go, is this an offer?
That's very kind of you.
Okay, good.
So I think two things here, you probably can hear me. Two things here are striking. First, which is probably not very surprising, we have huge differences in spending preferences across the OECD countries. But the second thing, and this is more important to me, is that we have an increase of the average spending for the last 40 to 50 years of about 50 percentage points of GDP. So it seems, which is probably not surprising to us as well, but it seems that the government is expanding over the last 40 and 50 years. Now, when you change to the second slide, or to the second table here, this increase of government spending is not mirrored when you look at the government balance. Well, okay. Okay, this one, yes. This is not mirrored by the government balance. As you can see here, the average stays in deficit. So it seems that there might be an equilibrium in politics for deficit bias. There might be an equilibrium that politics try, it's easier in politics to spend than to tax. And if you go to the next slide, this is mirrored, of course, in the rising debt levels we have all across the countries. So I think the debt overhang as a consequence of this equilibrium in politics, in the deficit and in a deficit bias, is a fact that we have seen, we have experienced over the last 40 to 50 years. Now, why that? Why do politicians try to spend without to tax? Why is it more easy to spend than to get the corresponding revenues? In economic theory, there is a special field named public choice or political economy that tries to explain this asymmetry in responsibility of revenues and spending, that tries to explain why we have this debt overhang and why we have the deficit bias in politics. The starting point of the theory is probably not very surprising, but that we have to see that politicians, as well as all other human beings, are self-interested. So it's not necessarily that they try to maximize social welfare, but that they try to maximize their own interests. And when we take for granted that we have a huge heterogeneity of preferences, that we have principal agent problems between the different actors in the political sphere, then the interplay might result in a deficit bias. And the following theories I will present you are basically starting from the assumption that we have self-interested political agents and that we have a heterogeneity of the political preferences. So the first theory that came up in the 70s by Nobel laureate James Buchanan and his co-author Rick Wagoner in his famous book Democracy in Deficit. The basic argument here is that if you think of an economy having these economic cycles, then if you try to counteract, try to have counter-cyclical policies, it's much easier to increase spending and reduce taxes in the economic downturn, while doing the opposite, doing vice versa in the economic boom. So there is an asymmetry, according to Buchanan and Wagner, there is an asymmetry for political interests in the boom than compared to the recession. So it might be that over the business cycle you can see an increase in government indebtedness according to these business cycle fluctuations. A second theory is the theory of strategic use of debt. It was invented by Harvard economist Alberto Alsina and his co-author Guido Tabellini from Bocconi. And their argument is that a government that is very close to election and faces a high probability of being not re-elected has a huge incentive to use debt as an instrument to commit the future government. So the debt instrument is an instrument to commit future government on spending targeted to the interest groups of the former government. And in this argumentation, you will see a ratchet effect of government indebtedness whenever you have a turnover of the government. This is the second theory, the strategic use of debt. That is, of course, only a reasonable theory if you have this Westminster type of democracy. The next theory is the well-known tragedy of the fiscal of commons, which was invented already or came up in the economic literature already in the 40s. And the argument here is that you have an asymmetry in spending and revenue responsibilities by politicians, because it is easy in a common pool to free ride on the contributions by others and try to target the spendings to the own constituency while spreading the costs of all these of the financing on the whole constituency. So if you have the asymmetry and the incentive to free ride on others, then the result, of course, will be a deficit bias in politics. And the next theory, which is some sort a derivative of the tragedy of the common pool, is that of the fragmentation of decision-making power. The argument here is that in politics you have often a fragmented decision-making. You have a cabinet with different interests, you have a parliament with different interests, you have a federal system with different interests, and the interplay of all these different interests is very close to what I have said to the tragedy of the fiscal commons, that as a spending minister, I'm only interested in targeted spending, but I don't care about the financing of this targeted spending. And so the only two in the cabinet who take responsibility for the whole budget are the prime minister and the finance minister, because they have to balance the budget. So the larger the cabinet and the more spending ministers, the more you have an asymmetry between those who take responsibility for the whole budget and those who try to target spending and spread out the revenues. Of course, the extent of that fragmentation problem depends on the concrete design of the budget process, it depends on the political system, it depends on the electoral system. There is an argument by German economist Jürgen von Hagen, who argues that if you have some hierarchy in the cabinet, the so-called Richtlinienkompetenz, then it is possible to circumvent this fragmentation problem to a large extent. Now, these are some of the these are some of the main theories we see in the economic literature. Last one, brought up by Kydland and Prescott, also Nobel laureates, is the time inconsistency problem. And this problem argues that it is very easy to commit on broad-based targets, like we should balance the budget over the business cycle. This is a very easy rule. But when it comes to be concrete, when the spending claims of the interest groups come up, then it's much harder to resist these spending claims. And so you have an asymmetry between the broad-based rules and the concrete spending claims. And the fiscal rule is in essence an instrument that tries to bring the time inconsistency problem together so that, like Odysseus, you have to tie your hands in advance so you can resist in the future all the spending claims that might come up and might be a reason to violate the rule. So institutions, and we would argue, as an economist, we would argue that the fiscal rule is an institution, as all other rules too. Institutions like the fiscal rule could impose constraints on the behavior of all these political agents, and could bring this asymmetry of responsibilities of spending and revenue together. And this is the easy and basic reasoning of having a fiscal rules. Now, of course, there are possible different solution of design of such a of such a fiscal rule, you have these numerical rules like the balanced budget rule, which is in place, as I heard, in the US states. You have debt limits. The Swiss rule is in basically a debt limit. You have expenditure ceilings. Then you have these procedural rules. As I said, Jürgen von Hagen would argue that the Richtlinienkompetenz in the German cabinet is some of these procedural rules that might overcome the tragedy of the commons. And then you have a last discussion that came up by some Anglo-Saxon economists, the Fiscal Policy Council. Here the argument is that compared to central banking, you could try to make fiscal policy become more independent from politics, to make it more technocratic, and that similar to the central banks, the finance minister is independent and you have a council that has to take the surveillance of a balanced budget, and this is outside of the political sphere. Of course, the distribution of all these spending items belongs to the parliament, but the balancing the budget is responsible with the policy council here. Now, the next slide shows you the involvement of all fiscal rules that have been counted by the International Monetary Fund over the years. And you can see in the 90s we had very few fiscal rules. These are numerical rules, procedural rules, councils, you name it. We have started in the 90s with very few rules, and as you can see, it evolved quite a bit over time, so that we nowadays count more than 90 fiscal rules for all the governments that are counted by the IMF. And the interesting thing is that when we distinguish between advanced, emerging, and low-income countries, it doesn't seem that fiscal rule is only an institution that applies for advanced economies, but it's also a rule that sticks to advanced and emerging and low-income countries. Now, what is the effect of these fiscal rules in place? Now, I have to admit that the empirical the empirical evidence of the working of these rules is mixed at best. And the reason is, of course, very, very straightforward, is very obvious. All these rules have different targets, so it is not surprising that with different targets you have different resulting effects. I would argue that they are mainly successful in restraining the targeted aggregates, but sometimes the targeted are not very soundly defined. So this is one of the problems. We could also call it's the problem of the budget coverage. Most of the rules that I know have a very low ratio of budget coverage, and of course there you open the room for circumventing the rule, that you transfer expenditures to subunits, to special entities that you have or engage in creative accounting, you engage in off-budget items. There is a nice literature showing that the effect of the fiscal rule is much more on the budget than on the real outcome. So the effect of the rule was not that the budget was, that the government finances ameliorated, but that the error in budget protection was significantly increasing. And of course, this is not the reason. Why we should implement the fiscal rule. It is, in that case, only an incentive for engaging in creative accounting. So the rule is not a rule. I would argue that the surveying the economic literature, the determinants of success are that you have a constitutional basis. This is, of course, good news for constitutional lawyers, that a proper fiscal rule should have its basis in the Constitution, you should have a clear and sound target that is really covering a major part of the budget. That you have a control quantity, meaning that it is important to define a trigger so that politics knows if this trigger is violated, then the rule is violated, and after the violation of this trigger, politics have to act. They have to some sort deviate from the path they're following right now. And then you have to define in the law the correction mechanisms, what expenditure cuts and what tax increases shall be tackled after a violation of the trigger. And of course, one of the probably most important things is how can we enforce the rule? I mean, the rule is nicely designed, but if politics doesn't want to follow the rule, how could we enforce politics to follow the rule? Now, I give you some experience from Switzerland. As I said, we have introduced it in 2003. You see here the development of Swiss indebtedness before we engaged in a fiscal rule, and you see even though we have probably a reputation of sound public finances, during the 1990s we experienced high indebtedness and we experienced quite soaring public indebtedness. Now, I have summarized this here. We had rising debt levels, a failure in implementing counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Swiss fiscal policy was quite pro-cyclical, which is not the idea. We had a failure of previously implemented fiscal rules. They were not stringent. The mechanism, the correction mechanism didn't work properly. So we engaged then afterwards in this debt break. In 2001, the Swiss population had to vote on, in a referendum, to vote on the debt break, and luckily 85% of all voters approved to the fiscal rule, and from 2003 on the rule was in place and is now restraining the federal government and the federal parliament. Now, the goal of the Swiss debt break is a stabilizing of the nominal gross debt. You can discuss whether this is a good or a bad thing, but what we basically do is we try to check the nominal gross debt. We have a control quantity. The trigger here is the capital finance account must be balanced over the business cycle. And how do we do that? We have expenditure limits, and these limits for the parliament are given by the estimated revenue in the following year, corrected by the business cycle, corrected by the trend GDP over GDP, which represents the business cycle. So in the end, the fiscal rule does two things. It balances the budget over the business cycle, and it works counter-cyclical. This is important also for the political and the support of the parliament. We have an exclusion of extraordinary expenditures and revenues because these follow another cycle, and we have tried to correct them in the correction mechanism so that all these extra funds and extra spending have to be amortized over a certain amount of time. And we have stipulated in the law some escape clause so that in times of crises, in times of wars, it's not possible, of course, to follow the fiscal rule, but I think it's important to clearly say what circumstances are possible for the escape clause, so that it's not the political discretion that can discuss about the deviation possibilities. Now, next slide, please. Now, what was the effect of the rule? You can see here Up to 2003, when it was introduced, we have huge deficit bias, and afterwards the budget ameliorated quite a bit. Of course, it was also a good business cycle that helped, but it seems that the rule worked. And in the next slide you see, no, it's the next one. Yes, in the next slide you see that the rule exactly does what it should do. It stabilizes nominal gross debt and it reduces the debt ratio to GDP. So we experienced over the Great Recession, where many countries have experienced an increase in indebtedness, we have increased a reduction of indebtedness over GDP over the last some years. 5 minutes, yes, I'll do that. Next slide, please. Now, one argument against the rule, of course, that is also very present in Swiss politics is, well, the rule is too strict. The rule will cut back all investment spending, and therefore the future generation will suffer because of too few investment spending. As you can see here, this is the development of all spendings. It's the development of investment spending, and it's the development of spending for education, for research, and for infrastructure, for transportation infrastructure. And as you can see here, I mean, not all the developments are very close, but the deviation from the general spending path is not too much. So for the Swiss case, we would argue there was not a reduction of the investment spending, was not a reduction of spending for education. The opposite is true with the regime of the fiscal rule. So let me conclude. I think or hope I could explain to you why economists think a fiscal rule is needed to bring responsibilities for spending and revenues in politics together. Because there is a debt overhang, there is an incentive for deficit bias, it is a good idea to have a rule that sticks these things together. Of course, the success of a fiscal rule depends on the concrete design. The appropriate design of the fiscal rule, according to what I have seen in the economic literature, is that you have to have a sound target, you have a control quantity, meaning trigger must be in place in the law, that you have to define a correction mechanism, what has to be done if the trigger is violated, and then, of course, the enforcement mechanism is very crucial. How can we enforce politics to do the things they probably don't want to do? And of course, transparency is always an important thing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. SCHALTEGGER, for this very, very important and interesting presentation. Je suis sûr que dans le débat, nous allons avoir l'occasion tout à l'heure de revenir sur certains des points que vous avez évoqués, parce que votre communication extrêmement précise et riche met l'accent sur une des questions centrales de nos débats. C'est une certaine contradiction entre la théorie économique que vous avez présentée et la théorie démocratique qui est le fondement du droit constitutionnel contemporain. Bon, et là, j'ai relevé à plusieurs reprises encore dans votre conclusion des phrases du type « Comment obliger les décideurs politiques à être plus raisonnables ?» ce qui est évidemment une vraie question, mais dont la réponse appartient du point de vue de la théorie démocratique aux électeurs et non pas à d'autres, disons, élites intellectuelles. Et il y a dans le raisonnement dont vous êtes fait l'écho et que je connais pour avoir été économiste en mon temps, une idée qui m'apparaît gênante par rapport à ce que représente la théorie démocratique, c'est l'idée que les décideurs publics sont d'abord actionnés par leur propre volonté de réélection et non pas par l'intérêt général ou un intérêt général défini par ailleurs. Alors je pense que ce genre de question reviendra rapidement dans la discussion dans quelques temps. Mais j'aurais moi aussi, bon, à ce moment-là, éventuellement une ou deux questions, et notamment j'ai toujours des inquiétudes sur les statistiques globales provenant d'organisations comme les CDE, le FMI, la Banque mondiale, etc. Quand on agrège des résultats de systèmes politiques très différents, et dans les premières images que vous avez projetées sur les dépenses gouvernementales, government expenditure, est-ce qu'on tient compte en réalité des différences de structure des pays, gouvernement central, gouvernements locaux, structures parapubliques, etc., and so on, et c'est toujours une difficulté pour comparer d'un pays à l'autre. Voilà. Mais permettez-moi simplement une dernière observation qui concerne votre pays, pour lequel nous avons tous une grande admiration, et puisque vous venez de Lucerne, sauf erreur, vous devez admirer le lac des Quatre Cantons assez souvent. Eh bien, la Suisse, du point de vue politique, présente une caractéristique fantastique, c'est le carré magique de la composition de son gouvernement. Et à partir du moment où il y a un consensus pour que tout le monde gouverne ensemble, à l'inverse de la plupart des pays où nous avons une majorité ou une opposition, ça facilite effectivement un certain nombre de décisions de longue période. Voilà. Mais je suis sorti là de mon rôle de président, mais on m'a dit qu'il s'agissait aussi d'animer un petit peu la discussion, et donc je vous renvoie à ce que nous dirons en fin de matinée.